Today, we're diving into the incredibly dramatic, honestly almost Shakespearean tragic arc of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. We're going to trace a journey that kicks off in academia, peaks with some of the most sweeping domestic reforms in American history, and then, well, it ends in this heartbreaking collapse of both a global vision and a leader's own physical health. It's an absolutely fascinating story of power, ideals, and the literal limits of human endurance. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive right in by looking at exactly how Wilson actually viewed the presidency itself. You know, much like Teddy Roosevelt before him, Woodrow Wilson fundamentally saw himself the personal representative of the people. In his own words, he firmly believed that no one but the president is expected to look out for the general interests of the country. This singular, rock-solid belief in the moral authority of the president, that's the engine that drove his greatest triumphs, and eventually set the absolute stage for his dramatic downfall.
To really grasp his worldview, we've got to look at his roots. Born in Virginia in December of 1856 to a Presbyterian minister, his early life was entirely shaped by the American South during a wildly tumultuous time. His dad was actually a pastor in Georgia during the Civil War, and later a professor in South Carolina during Reconstruction. So Wilson witnessed the absolute frightfulness of war firsthand as a young boy. And that's a crucial detail. It heavily influenced his later, intense hesitation to enter global conflicts. He eventually pivoted to academia, earning a doctorate at Johns Hopkins, and kicked off a career in education alongside his wife Ellen Louise Axon, who he married in 1885.
Section 1. From Professor to President.
This timeline is just wild. Wilson advanced super rapidly as a young political science professor and actually became the president of Princeton University in 1902. His growing national rep caught the eye of some conservative Democrats who started looking at him as genuine presidential timber. So, they persuaded him to run for governor of New Jersey in 1910, probably figuring, hey, we can easily manage this former academic. Well, they were wrong. Wilson asserted total independence. He broke completely away from the conservatives and the political machine that nominated him, strongly pushing a progressive platform. And incredibly, just 2 years later, in 1912, he was running for the presidency.
Nominated at the 1912 Democratic Convention, Wilson campaigned on this sweeping program he famously called the New Freedom. Now, the dynamics of this election were honestly incredible. It was a three-way race against sitting President William Howard Taft and former President Theodore Roosevelt. Because that opposition was split down the middle, Wilson secured only a plurality of the popular vote. But that plurality translated into an overwhelming, dominant majority of electoral votes, officially handing him the keys to the White House to implement his vision.
Section 2. The New Freedom Reforms.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the sheer scale and the lasting impact of his early legislative successes. I mean, he skillfully maneuvered three massive pieces of legislation right through Congress. First up, the Underwood Act, which lowered tariffs and, significantly, attached a graduated federal income tax. Next was the Federal Reserve Act. This provided the nation with a much-needed elastic money supply to help stabilize the economy. And then, in 1914, he championed antitrust legislation that created the Federal Trade Commission, designed specifically to prohibit unfair business practices. These are massive, game-changing institutional shifts, like the income tax and the Fed, that literally still shape our daily lives and our economy today.
And he didn't stop there. Another huge burst of new laws followed in 1916. Under Wilson, legislation was passed that explicitly prohibited child labor and limited railroad workers to an 8-hour day. These progressive domestic victories, combined with his wildly popular 1916 campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," proved to be exactly what he needed. By leaning hard on his domestic record and the promise of continued neutrality while a massive global conflict was raging, Wilson narrowly secured his re-election.
Section 3. Making the World Safe.
The pivot here is honestly jarring. In 1916, remember, he won on the fact that he kept the nation out of the World War. But just shortly after the election, Wilson concluded that America simply could not remain neutral any longer. On April 2, 1917, he stood before Congress and asked for a formal declaration of war on Germany. He asserted international leadership and famously proclaimed that American entrance into World War I was a profound crusade to make the world safe for democracy.
Section 4. Architect of the Peace.
So, in January 1918, with the war still actively raging across Europe, Wilson went before Congress again. This time, it was to explicitly enunciate American war aims. He laid out this comprehensive, ambitious framework for peace that became known to history as the 14 Points.
And this brilliantly illustrates his grand vision. The very last of those 14 points was by far the most ambitious, the creation of the League of Nations. He envisioned this as a general association of nations that would provide mutual guarantees of both political independence and territorial integrity. And the kicker? This protection was to be afforded to great and small states alike. It was a completely revolutionary idea for global cooperation at the time.
Once the Germans finally signed the armistice in November 1918, Wilson personally traveled to Paris. He was absolutely determined to use his influence to build an enduring peace right out of the ashes of the war. After some intensely grueling negotiations, he returned home and presented the Versailles Treaty to the United States Senate. Crucially, this treaty contained the covenant of his prized League of Nations. To make it work, he desperately needed the Senate's approval to bind the United States to this new international system.
So, the crucial point here is how heavily Wilson weighed the moral imperative of this treaty. He posed this exact, incredibly emotional question to the Senate: dare we reject it and break the heart of the world? He viewed the League of Nations not just as some political treaty, but as a sacred obligation to humanity to prevent the exact kind of frightfulness of war he had detested ever since his childhood.
Section 5. The Tragic Final Years.
Now, let's walk through this cascading series of failures. The midterm election of 1918 had shifted the balance of power in Congress right over to the Republicans. Despite Wilson's impassioned pleas, the Versailles Treaty failed in the Senate by a razor-thin margin of just 7 votes. Desperate and going completely against the explicit warnings of his doctors, the president embarked on a grueling, exhausting national tour to try and mobilize public sentiment directly for the treaty. But the physical toll was just too great. Exhausted from the campaign trail, Wilson suffered a massive, near-fatal stroke in October 1919.
The aftermath of that stroke introduces a really profound, tragic irony. The man who so fervently believed the president was the sole representative of the people was now entirely incapacitated and isolated. He was tenderly nursed by his second wife, Edith. In fact, to protect him, she kept away most visitors and actually stepped in to make key executive decisions herself. It's gotten to the point where some historians even refer to her as the first unofficial female president. The great representative of the people was now totally cut off from them, operating in secret behind closed doors. Wilson never fully recovered his strength or his political leverage. His dream of the United States leading the League of Nations was effectively dead. He left office at the end of his term, choosing to remain in Washington, D.C. He lived quietly in the capital city for a few more years until his death on February 3, 1924.
Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder. We've seen a man who rapidly rose to power, completely overhauled the American economic and regulatory system with these lasting new freedom reforms, yet suffered a devastating physical and political collapse trying to forge a new world order. So, when a leader's sweeping domestic successes are forced to compete with the sheer tragic magnitude of their ultimate global defeat, how do we actually measure that legacy? It's a complex question about a complex president, and one that really challenges how we view the successes and failures of those who hold the highest office. I really hope this deep dive helped clarify the fascinating rise and fall of Woodrow Wilson.